Good evening, and welcome to Truth Report. I'm Alex Truth, and tonight we have a packed show. We're covering stories that the mainstream media either buries or sanitizes beyond recognition. From Palestine Action activists finally reuniting with their families after brutal detention, to Iran's supreme leader preparing for what he clearly sees as an inevitable confrontation, to the 4-year anniversary of Russia's war in Ukraine and what it's actually done to Russian society. We're also looking at FIFA and UEFA potentially facing the International Criminal Court. Let's get into it.
And I'm Maya Clarity. Let's start with a story that got almost zero coverage in Western mainstream outlets. 12 Palestine Action activists in the United Kingdom have been reunited with their families after finally being granted bail. These are people who were locked up, some of them on hunger strike, for the crime of protesting arms sales to Israel. According to Al Jazeera's reporting, these activists were targeted specifically because they disrupted the operations of companies like Elbit Systems, Israel's largest private weapons manufacturer. Let that sink in. In a supposed democracy, you go to prison for opposing weapons deals.
And Maya, let's be absolutely clear about what Palestine Action actually does. This is a direct action group that targets factories, headquarters, and offices of companies complicit in arming Israel. They've blockaded Elbit Systems facilities across the UK, they've occupied rooftops, they've shut down production lines. And the British state's response has been to throw the book at them. We're talking about lengthy pre-trial detention, harsh bail conditions when bail is even granted, and charges that carry serious prison time. The fact that hunger strikes were necessary to even get bail tells you everything about where the British justice system's priorities lie.
Exactly. And here's what the mainstream media won't connect for you. The UK government approved over £300 million in arms export licenses to Israel in recent years. When activists physically intervene to stop those weapons from being manufactured and shipped, they're treated as criminals. But the companies building the drones and surveillance systems used in documented attacks on civilian populations in Gaza? They operate with full government backing. The 12 activists being reunited with their families is a small victory, but the system that jailed them remains fully intact and fully committed to protecting the arms trade.
And I want people to understand the human cost of what these activists endured. Hunger strikes are not publicity stunts. These are people who refused food, who put their bodies on the line, because the legal system offered them no other recourse. Some of them were held for months before trial. Their families were separated from them. Children went without parents. And all of this happened not because they committed violence, but because they tried to prevent violence. The framing in the few outlets that did cover this story often painted them as extremists. That framing is itself a form of violence against the truth.
Now let's pivot to a story that should have every geopolitical analyst paying close attention. Middle East Eye is reporting that Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, has reportedly entrusted his top security chief to run the country in the event of war or assassination. This is not normal contingency planning. This is a leader who sees the current trajectory as genuinely dangerous and is making preparations accordingly. The question we should all be asking is, what intelligence is Khamenei acting on that has prompted this level of preparation right now?
This is a massive story, Maya, and the context is critical. We've seen years of escalation. The assassination of Qasem Soleimani in 2020, the killing of nuclear scientists on Iranian soil, the ongoing sabotage operations against Iranian infrastructure, and now open talk in certain political circles about military strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities. Khamenei is 86 years old. He's not making these arrangements for theatrical purposes. When a head of state formally designates a successor for wartime continuity, that tells you the threat assessment at the highest levels is severe.
And let's talk about who the security chief is and what this means structurally. Iran's security apparatus is layered and complex, with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps operating as essentially a parallel military and economic power. By entrusting continuity of government to a security figure rather than a purely political one, Khamenei is signaling that in a crisis scenario, Iran's response will be militarily driven, not diplomatically driven. This is a shift in posture that Western media should be screaming about, but instead, the coverage has been minimal and largely dismissive.
And here's the broader pattern that no one in mainstream media wants to acknowledge. The Middle East is being systematically destabilized, and the destabilization benefits a very specific set of actors. Arms manufacturers see their stock prices rise with every escalation. Defense contractors secure new billion-dollar deals. And the geopolitical players pushing for confrontation with Iran are often the same ones who pushed for the Iraq War, who supported the Libya intervention, who backed the Saudi war in Yemen. The playbook hasn't changed. Only the target has shifted.
What's particularly alarming is the timing. This report comes as diplomatic channels between Iran and Western powers are at their most strained in years. The nuclear deal is dead. Sanctions are crushing Iran's economy, which always hits ordinary people hardest, not the regime. And the assassination of senior Iranian figures, both military and scientific, has created a siege mentality in Tehran that makes diplomacy nearly impossible. When you corner a nation like this, when you eliminate their leaders and strangle their economy, you don't get compliance. You get exactly the kind of war preparation we're seeing now.
Now let's turn to Ukraine, because this week marks 4 years since Russia's full-scale invasion, and Al Jazeera has published a deeply revealing piece about how the war has changed Russia itself. And I want to be clear here, we can hold two truths simultaneously. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is illegal and devastating to the Ukrainian people, and the war is also transforming Russian society in ways that will have consequences for decades. The reporting shows curbs on civil rights, fewer consumer choices, economic distortions, and yet, remarkably, public support for the war remains high.
And that paradox of high support despite material decline is something we need to unpack honestly, without resorting to the lazy Western narrative that Russians are simply brainwashed. Yes, state media plays a role. Yes, there is repression of dissent. But there's also a genuine siege mentality that has been reinforced by NATO expansion, by Western sanctions, by the perception that Russia is fighting for its survival as a civilization. You don't have to agree with that framing to understand that it's real for millions of Russians, and dismissing it makes it impossible to find a path to peace.
What Al Jazeera's reporting highlights is the everyday reality. Store shelves that once carried European products now carry domestic or Chinese alternatives. Independent media has been virtually eliminated. Anti-war voices face prison sentences of up to 15 years. The economy has been restructured around military production, which creates a perverse incentive to continue the war because entire communities now depend on defense industry jobs. This is what happens when a war economy takes root. It becomes self-perpetuating, and the people who suffer most are ordinary citizens on both sides.
And let's connect this to what's happening on the ground in Ukraine right now, because our fifth story tonight is directly related. Al Jazeera is reporting that at least one person has been killed in what they describe as wide-scale Russian attacks on Ukraine's energy sector. President Zelensky confirmed that the main targets were energy infrastructure, but residential buildings and a railway were also damaged. This is not a new tactic. Russia has systematically targeted Ukrainian energy infrastructure, particularly during winter months, as a strategy to break civilian morale.
This is a war crime, full stop. Deliberately targeting civilian energy infrastructure in winter, when people depend on electricity for heat, for water, for basic survival, meets the definition of collective punishment under international humanitarian law. And yet, 4 years in, there is no accountability mechanism that has meaningfully deterred these attacks. The International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin, but he continues to travel to friendly nations. The warrant has become symbolic rather than consequential. And meanwhile, Ukrainian civilians freeze in the dark.
And here's what the Western coverage consistently fails to address. The diplomatic efforts to end this war have been virtually non-existent for the past 2 years. The early negotiations in Istanbul in 2022 were reportedly close to producing a framework for peace, but they collapsed under circumstances that remain disputed. Since then, the dominant Western position has been to arm Ukraine and wait for a Russian collapse that shows no signs of coming. For years of war, hundreds of thousands of casualties on both sides, and the policy establishment still has no viable exit strategy. That's not support for Ukraine. That's using Ukraine.
And the energy attacks are escalating precisely because there's no diplomatic pressure to stop them. When you tell one side that negotiation equals surrender, and you tell the other side that there will be no meaningful consequences for targeting civilians, you get exactly this outcome. Endless war, endless suffering, and an arms industry that posts record profits quarter after quarter. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, BAE Systems, these companies are not neutral observers. They are active participants in perpetuating conflicts that generate demand for their products.
Now let's get to a story that might seem out of place on a war-focused show, but it's actually deeply connected to everything we've been discussing. Al Jazeera reports that UEFA and FIFA may face referral to the International Criminal Court for ignoring Israeli violations. A landmark legal complaint argues that by allowing Israeli football teams to participate in international competitions without consequence, while Russia was immediately banned after invading Ukraine, These governing bodies are applying international law selectively and are therefore complicit in the violations they ignore.
This is a brilliant piece of legal strategy, Maya, and here's why it matters. The double standard is so blatant that it's almost impossible to defend. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, FIFA and UEFA moved within days to ban Russian clubs and the Russian national team from all competitions. That was the right thing to do. Sports organizations should not provide a platform for nations engaged in illegal military aggression. But apply that same standard to Israel, which has been documented by the International Court of Justice as maintaining an illegal occupation, and suddenly the sports world goes silent.
And this isn't just about football. It's about the architecture of selective accountability that governs the entire international system. The ICJ issued an advisory opinion stating that Israel's occupation of Palestinian territories is illegal. The ICC has issued arrest warrants for Israeli officials. Multiple UN resolutions have condemned the occupation and settlement expansion. And yet, Israel participates fully in every international sporting, cultural, and economic institution. The referral to the ICC argues that FIFA and UEFA leadership, by maintaining this double standard, are not just being hypocritical. They're actively aiding and abetting violations of international law.
And let's be honest about why this double standard exists. It exists because the same Western powers that dominate FIFA and UEFA governance are the same powers that provide diplomatic cover for Israel at the United Nations, that supply it with weapons, and that criminalize activists like the Palestine Action members we discussed earlier for trying to disrupt the arms pipeline. It's all connected. The sports ban on Russia and the refusal to ban Israel are not contradictions. They're perfectly consistent expressions of a power structure that applies rules based on political alignment, not legal principle.
If this ICC referral gains traction, and there are serious legal scholars who believe it has merit, it could establish a precedent that sports governing bodies have obligations under international humanitarian law. That would be seismic. It would mean that every time FIFA or UEFA allows a state credibly accused of war crimes to participate, their leadership could face personal criminal liability. The implications extend far beyond Israel and Palestine. It would create a framework for holding these massively powerful organizations accountable for the political choices they make while hiding behind the fiction that sports are apolitical.
Now I want to step back and connect all 5 of these stories, because when you lay them side by side, a clear pattern emerges. In the UK, activists who try to stop weapons from reaching conflict zones are imprisoned. In Iran, a nation that has been systematically targeted for regime change is preparing for war. In Russia, 4 years of conflict have created a militarized society with no off-ramp. In Ukraine, civilians are dying in energy attacks while the world debates weapons shipments instead of peace negotiations. And in the world of international sports, the rules are applied based on who your allies are, not what you've done.
The common thread is the weaponization of institutions. Legal systems weaponized against activists. International bodies weaponized to legitimize some aggressions while punishing others. Media weaponized to manufacture consent for endless war. Economic systems weaponized through sanctions that starve populations while enriching defense contractors. These are not separate crises. They are different fronts in the same war, a war waged by a global power structure against accountability, against peace, and against the ordinary people who bear the cost of every bomb dropped and every sanction imposed.
And let's talk about the media's role specifically, because this is Truth Report and we exist because mainstream media fails at exactly this kind of analysis. When the BBC covers Palestine Action, they frame it as criminal activity. When CNN covers Iran, they frame it as a rogue state. When Fox News covers Ukraine, it's either total support or total opposition depending on the political winds. None of them connect the dots. None of them ask who profits. None of them challenge the fundamental assumption that the current international order is legitimate or just. That's our job, and it's your job as informed citizens to demand better.
I want to go back to the Iran story for a moment because there's an element we haven't fully explored. The designation of a security chief as the continuity of government figure suggests that Khamenei has assessed that existing constitutional succession mechanisms are inadequate for a wartime scenario. Iran's constitution provides for the assembly of experts to select a new supreme leader, but that process takes time. In a war or assassination scenario, there would be no time. This extra-legal arrangement tells us that Iran's leadership believes a decapitation strike is a real possibility, not a theoretical one.
And that should terrify everyone, because a decapitation strike on Iran would trigger a regional conflagration that would make everything we've seen in the last 4 years look like a prelude. Iran has allies and proxies across the Middle East. It has missile capabilities that could reach every U.S. military base in the region. It has the ability to close the Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of the world's oil passes. The people pushing for military confrontation with Iran are either ignorant of these realities or they welcome the chaos because chaos is profitable for the right people.
Let's also note that the 4-year anniversary of the Ukraine war is being used by different political factions for very different purposes. Some are using it to argue for more weapons. Others are using it to argue for forced concessions from Ukraine. Almost nobody in the mainstream is using it to argue for what's actually needed, which is a genuine, good-faith diplomatic process that addresses the security concerns of all parties. And I say all parties deliberately, because lasting peace requires acknowledging that Russia has security concerns, even if you condemn how Russia has acted on those concerns. That's not appeasement. That's diplomacy.
And the energy attacks on Ukraine, Maya, they highlight something that often gets lost in the geopolitical chess game. Real people are suffering right now. A person was killed in these latest attacks. Families are without power in freezing temperatures. Children are being raised in bomb shelters. And every time we reduce this to a debate about weapons systems and strategic positioning, we dehumanize the very people we claim to care about. The war in Ukraine needs to end. Not on Russia's terms, not on NATO's terms, but on terms that stop the killing and give Ukrainian and Russian people alike a future worth living.
Coming back to the Palestine Action story, I think it's important to highlight the legal precedent being set. The UK government has used counter-terrorism frameworks and conspiracy charges against peaceful activists. This isn't just about Palestine. If the state can imprison people for disrupting an arms factory, it can imprison people for disrupting oil pipelines, for blockading military bases, for any form of direct action that challenges corporate or state power. The 12 activists reunited with their families are the canary in the coal mine for civil liberties in the United Kingdom, and by extension, across the Western world.
That's exactly right. And notice how the criminalizing of activism works in tandem with the sports story. When Palestine Action activists are jailed, the message is clear: physical resistance to the arms trade will be punished. When FIFA and UEFA refuse to sanction Israel the way they sanctioned Russia, the message is equally clear: institutional resistance will be blocked. When the ICC issues warrants that go unenforced, the message is: even legal resistance is performative. Every avenue of accountability is being systematically closed off, and then those in power wonder why people feel desperate and unheard.
And this is where the FIFA and UEFA ICC referral becomes so significant strategically. It's an attempt to open a new avenue of accountability that the power structure hasn't yet figured out how to close. By targeting the personal liability of sports administrators, rather than states or corporations, it bypasses many of the diplomatic immunities and institutional protections that have shielded decision-makers thus far. Gianni Infantino and Alexander Ceferin may personally face scrutiny for decisions they've made. That kind of individual accountability has a way of changing behavior very quickly.
Let's also talk about what 4 years of war have done to the information environment in Russia, because this connects directly to why the war persists. Al Jazeera's reporting notes that independent media has been effectively eliminated inside Russia. Outlets like Novaya Gazeta, TV Rain, and Echo of Moscow were shut down or forced abroad. Social media is heavily monitored. Using the word war instead of special military operation can land you in prison. This information blackout means that millions of Russians genuinely do not have access to reporting about what their military is doing in Ukraine. You cannot hold people accountable for what they don't know.
But we should also be honest about our own information environment, Alex. Western media has its own blind spots and its own forms of manufacturing consent. The coverage of Ukraine consistently frames the conflict as unprovoked, ignoring decades of NATO expansion, the 2014 coup, and the Minsk agreements that were never implemented in good faith. The coverage of Palestine consistently platforms Israeli government narratives while marginalizing Palestinian voices. The coverage of Iran is almost entirely filtered through the lens of the nuclear program, stripping Iranians of their full humanity and political complexity. Propaganda is not uniquely Russian. It's a feature of every power system.
And that's why shows like this one matter. We're not here to tell you what to think. We're here to show you what you're not being shown and connect what you're not being asked to connect. Tonight's 5 stories, taken individually, look like separate events in separate regions. But taken together, they reveal a global system that criminalizes dissent, prepares for wars that will benefit no one but arms dealers, destroys civilian infrastructure with impunity, and applies international law like a weapon rather than a principle. That's the truth that mainstream media won't report, and that's why we're called Truth Report.
So here's our call to action, and we mean this sincerely. First, support Palestine Action and political prisoners everywhere. Write to them, donate to their legal defense funds, and show up at their court dates. They risked their freedom for your conscience. Second, demand that your elected representatives push for diplomacy on Ukraine and Iran, not more weapons, not more sanctions, but actual negotiations aimed at ending conflicts rather than managing them. Third, support the ICC referral against FIFA and UEFA leadership. Share it, talk about it, make it impossible to ignore.
Fourth, seek out independent media. If you're watching this show, you're already doing that, but go further. Read Al Jazeera, read Middle East Eye, read Declassified UK, read The Intercept, read journalists who are working outside the corporate media system that is structurally incapable of telling you the truth about power. Fifth, and this is the hardest one, resist the urge to pick a side in a geopolitical chess game and instead pick the side of civilians everywhere. Ukrainian civilians, Russian conscripts, Palestinian families, Iranian workers. The people who pay the price for wars they didn't choose deserve our solidarity, regardless of which flag flies over them.
Before we go, I want to leave you with one thought. Every single story we covered tonight involves a system designed to prevent accountability. The UK legal system protecting arms dealers. Iran's power structure preparing for war rather than being offered peace. Russia's information blackout hiding the war's true cost. Energy attacks on Ukrainian civilians going unpunished. FIFA and UEFA shielding one nation from the consequences another nation faced for similar actions. The question is not whether these systems are broken. They're working exactly as designed. The question is whether we have the courage to demand something different. I'm Maya Clarity.
And I'm Alex Truth. We'll be back next week with more stories the mainstream won't touch. Until then, stay informed, stay critical, and never stop asking who benefits. Good night.